Real pleasure for me to introduce Mushahid Hussain this afternoon. I'll be very brief, as I'm sure he's quite familiar to most of you, having successfully defended his fascinating dissertation this past summer. Mushahid is currently an assistant professor of sociology and international studies at Indiana State University. He came to Cornell's graduate field of development sociology with 2 master's degrees. The first in economics from the distinguished Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi, and the second from the equally distinguished Department of Sociology at Binghamton University, with a brief stint in between these as colleague lecturer at the International University of Business, Agriculture and Technology in Dhaka. His dissertation, based on extensive field and archival research and entitled Grounding Decolonization, Nationalist Time, Development Regimes, and Cold War Antinomies in the Making of Bangladesh, 1947 to 71, is a study of the contested dynamics of postcolonial state formation, the emergence of new middle classes, and the constitution of a national economy in Bangladesh, set in the global context of decolonization, the post-war global development initiative, and the geopolitics of the Cold War. Through this analytic framework, his research illuminates the transnational connections, political, economic, and cultural, that shaped the making of the Bangladeshi state and the dialectic of social inequality, citizenship constructs, and cultural difference that were constitutive of it. He has published different aspects of his research on development theory and history, higher education, labor and urban politics in various academic journals and edited volumes. As he'll be telling us about his research very shortly, let me just say that Mushahid was also a recipient of a prestigious postdoctoral fellowship from the Central European University Democracy Institute on the research theme of exclusionary regimes and autocratization, and this process of becoming autocratic, I guess, a weird word, which was to be housed in the Social Sciences Association in Colombo, Sri Lanka. Okay, without any further ado, welcome, Mushahid.
Thank you, Fuad, and for everyone being here again. Thanks for your patience. And again, first of all, I just want to quickly thank Fuad, you, and Philip McMichael and Viranjani Munasinghe, who were in my committee, and to all of you who have taken classes with, and I'm really glad to see some of you here, and my friends and peers, of course, who are listening from the room as well as are in Zoom right now. So without spending more time, I'll get right into it. So briefly, what I'll be doing today is talk a little bit about my academic journey, some of the broader research questions that inform my project. I'll spend a little bit of time, very briefly, on sort of questions of theory and method for maybe a couple of minutes, and then I'll get to the presentation for today, which is part of a chapter, research for a part of a chapter that I'd had in the dissertation, but it's something I'm reworking for an article as well right now. So I look forward to having a discussion later on. Okay, so let's begin. I begin with this quote from Svetlana Alexievich's work because it captures something fundamental about the relationship between history and memory. Here, she's reflecting on her interviews with women soldiers who had served with the Red Army during the Second World War. While mediated by trauma and tragedy, the relationship between history and memory also harbors a kind of melancholic hope that is sometimes brought forth in the act of narrating itself. My parents' generation is older than the nation state, which many of them had helped found in 1971, when the easternmost province and territorially separated province of Pakistan ceded to form the state of Bangladesh. The brutal war had affected or directly involved men, women, and children from every social segment. I grew up with stories of Bangladesh's liberation war, but there were never really war stories of the kind portrayed in textbooks or silver screen hits. They were about unexpected, mundane things and often came up in unexpected moments. Remembering is both a creative and a political act, since it is often about the negotiating of differences, an overcoming of odds, a rediscovery of interests, and an engendering of collective aspirations. It places the subject in relation to an imagined collective, through which the making of the subject can then be narrated. In other words, all the good stuff that constitutes an imagined political community in the time of nationalism, about which a lot is remembered and much forgotten. As the political theorist Ranabir Shamuddar put it in his account of the politics of memory in Bangladesh, the horizon of expectations and, quote, tantalizing possibilities of the nationalist hour is also held up on the basis of a collective amnesia. In conversations, memoirs, and biographies, the temporal point of reference for those who had lived through Bangladesh's founding does not simply take the events of 1971 as year zero. Rather, they are situated in the presence of another era between the end of British colonial rule and the partition of the Indian subcontinent in 1947 and the disintegration of Pakistan in 1971. This was, of course, the era of global decolonization, transforming social and political landscapes across Asia and Africa. The significance of this era is indicated today by the colloquial Bengali phrase Pakistan Amol, or the Pakistan years, around which the politics of history and memory continue to play out in contemporary Bangladesh. The time of decolonization indicates another, more reflexive and critical time. Narratives of political and social life during the Pakistan years signal not just the creativity of individual acts of remembrance, but what makes such acts creative in the first place. That is, recollections of a world where the remaking of self and society seemed plausible for most of the world's population. All of this informs the central questions that I address in my dissertation. How, and more importantly, why, did the very processes of mid-20th century decolonization, which tended to reproduce colonial structures and hierarchies of power and privilege, also contain the conditions of their transformation? Before defining decolonization as a set of interrelated processes and its salience for situating the scholarly stakes of my project in terms of both historiography and social theory, I want to clarify the prerogative that such questions impose. Much has been written about how and why, despite the radical hopes of anti-colonial liberation, colonial structures imbued in long-standing relations of class, race, gender, caste, region, religion, and tribe persisted in new forms and even strengthened in what we have come to recognize and inhabit as the post-colonial present. While my work builds on these contributions, I'm interested in historically specifying what has changed by describing and analyzing how such changes happened and explaining why they occurred when they did. To quote the Marxist historian David McNally's insightful reading of Walter Benjamin, my conjunctural conceptualization of the time of decolonization is intended not as a celebration of contingent particularity, but as a search for those fragments of the totality that oppose its totalizing logic. My project would have been a very different one if this prerogative were to be reversed. My approach to linking theory and history developed through engaging epistemological questions in historical sociology, social history, and historical anthropology. The current imperative to decolonize everything from disciplines to diets stem from what is potentially a laudable move to illuminate the blind spots or inadequacies of concepts and categories through which we narrate histories of the present. However, the risk of what Eric Hobsbawm once called the backward projection of present structures onto the past remains evident. Since the gap in our knowledge between what happened and what is said to have happened is unbridgeable, to use Michel Rolf Trouillot's suggestive formulation, decolonizing anything, including the study of postcolonial histories and political societies, cannot be separated from decolonization as a substantive socio-historical process. Such a process, or more accurately, a set of processes, needs to be grounded in a substantive theory of social change, along with an explication of its auxiliary dynamics. Hence, the title of my dissertation, Grounding Decolonization. In this case, Marx's theory of capital based on a critique of political economy and the uneven and combined development of capitalist commodity relations remain central to my approach. The path to my project followed a winding route. I began with a proposed study of contemporary urbanization in central Bangladesh, examining the dynamics of land, labor, and ecology driven by new forms of real estate-led development and labor precarity. My readings on Dhaka's urban history took me to the National Archives during a research trip in 2018. It was evident that the dynamic processes involved not only required a firmer grasp of what was happening in the countryside, but also a longer view for the kind of theoretically informed histories of continuity and change that interested me. I began to appreciate the significance of the Pakistan years when it came to the legal, social, and political arrangements shaping not only contemporary institutions and state practices, but the cultural coordinates through which inequalities were perpetuated and justified. Their transnational aspect, often downplayed by the black box of the Pakistan years in Bangladesh's national biography, appeared tangible in the preponderance of US agencies and private philanthropies like the Ford Foundation in state-making processes during the early years of the Cold War in Pakistan. So, I followed up by making an appointment at the Ford Foundation's archives housed at the Rockefeller Archive Center in Sleepy Hollow. I learned to read for what Ann Stoler calls negative prints in the records of state practices and official anxieties, documenting interests and expectations through which a different interpretation of the archival order might arise from below. I was also bringing political sociological debates in conversation with histories of Cold War diplomacy, development, and post-colonial political societies in South Asia. By then, my project was very different from what I had started out with. The case of pre-independent Bangladesh between 1947 and 71 is ideal for addressing how and why the processes of reproducing colonial hierarchies and practices contained the socio-historical conditions that transformed them. This is because of the staggered nature of formal decolonization between the independence of India and Pakistan and the founding of Bangladesh, to which I can speak more during Q&A. Sorry. Okay. Some, like the cultural theorist Poulomi Shaha, offers a socio-spatial conceptualization of pre-independent Bangladesh as East or Eastern Bengal, which, quote, persists between the ambit of two empires, British colonialism, by which it was originally bifurcated, and the American empire of debt, on which its statehood was erected, irreducible either to colonial forebearer or contemporary state. Building on this, I posit that the time of decolonization as a heuristic illuminates multiple temporalities through which both the societal and geopolitical registers of analysis are brought together in narrating the making of Bangladesh, both as a geopolitical entity and a social formation in 1971. To quote the late historical sociologist Dale Talmage, the task of theory here is, quote, not to elaborate laws that are imminent in history and dictate its development, but to provide a historically specific conceptual framework and theoretical categories that are appropriate for the analysis of concrete historical relations of capital. In other words, I define decolonization as a set of interrelated processes corresponding to distinct historical temporalities. These are the processes of middle-class formation in post-colonial societies, the institutionalization of democratic movements organized around regional, ethno-linguistic, and religious communal lines, the transnational dynamics of post-colonial state-making, and the political constitution of a national economy. I examine each of these processes across 4 chapters, where the conceptual thread figured by the time of decolonization runs through. The chapters contribute to historiographies on the relationship between the postcolonial state, civil and political society, and Cold War development politics. Contributions to Bangladesh and South Asian studies more broadly, including an earlier generation of work by political geographers and historians like Talukdar Maniruzzaman, Kamuddin Ahmed, Badruddin Umar, and Ronak Jahan, have been instrumental to my thinking. More recently, my methodological prerogative of situating and narrating aspects of mid-20th century decolonization against the grain of nationalist time have been pursued by scholars like Ahmed Kamal, Nur Kobir, Shubha Basu, Elora Shahabuddin, Tariq Umar Ali, Said Ferdos, Shali Felman, Laila Uddin, and many others. Historians of Cold War diplomacy in South Asia like Robert McMahon, as well as recent accounts of Cold War developmentalism by Amy Offner, Daniel Emerwar, David Engerman, Frederick Cooper, Ilan Kapoor, and many others, illuminating the contradictions of US hegemony from below, have also informed my work. So with this brief sort of introduction to my broader project, let me now turn to the main feature for today. What I'm going to present builds on research I've done for a chapter. I'm currently in the process of editing it as a standalone piece for a journal article, so I really look forward to your questions and feedback. So Arthur Raper was a resident at the Kumilla Academy for Rural Development in East Pakistan from 1962 to 1964. He was an external evaluator of the Academy's work, then directed by the civil servant and college teacher turned communitarian reformer Akhtar Hamid Khan. Its activities were sponsored by the Ford Foundation and the Pakistani government, with advisory support from Michigan State University's Agricultural College. By 1962, Raper was a well-renowned figure for his path-breaking works on the rural sociology of the American South and his advocacy for racial equality and agrarian democracy. His last major book-length work, published in 1970, was on Kumilla. It was a programmatic account of the Kumilla Project's activities. Methodical in tone, his biographer once remarked that this book lacked the colloquial wit and sharp discernment that were the hallmarks of his earlier works, written on subjects and lives closer to home. This was a work of, quote, documentation rather than documentary. Although out of his element, Raper's keen sense of places and peoples had not left him in Kumilla. In copious notes and correspondences during his 26 months there, we get glimpses of post-colonial world-making at work, of grand ideas embodied in daily practices and organizational politics. The Academy's activities were yielding, quote, real improvements in agricultural production and rural infrastructure. However, what impressed Raper the most were, quote, not the physical improvements, but by the means by which they were being achieved. Such means appeared similar to those Raper had witnessed growing up in central North Carolina's hill country during the early 20th century. They were also the ones he found lacking amid racialized inequalities in West Central Georgia, where he had spent years with Carl Taylor and other rural sociologists studying the dynamics of agrarian change during the 1920s. Young trainees at the Kumilla Academy, teachers, farmers, state officials, often asked him about how essential services and modern amenities like healthcare, education, roads, telephones, and electricity had become accessible to everyone in his American hometown. Raper described the process as follows. Farming communities had, quote, involved the people directly in prolonged discussions, through which they defined their needs and interests. Consequently, they were better able to mobilize, quote, individual contribution to labor and materials, and in various organized group activities. As this process matured, such contributions were, quote, provided increasingly by public funds in response to the ballot. In short, participatory democracy in everyday governance was said to have initiated a chain reaction, creating demands for services that laid the foundation for state-supported rural development. Under Akhtar Hamid Khan's directorship, the Kumilla Academy had initiated what appeared to be a similar process. involving peasant cultivators in deliberations over their felt needs, the Academy was building on a cooperative model abandoned by late British colonial efforts. This time, however, there was support and financial backing from new players in town, whose representatives, like Raper, seemed genuinely interested in listening to local agrarian concerns. Yet the process outlined by Raper and seemingly pursued by the Academy staff seemed to downplay entrenched rural inequalities pervading daily life. Persistent relations of power and privilege, deeply embedded in ideas and state practices, in laws and policies of inheritance and private property, in revenue arrangements and market relations, were seemingly moot in this world of rural developmental possibilities. Raper had no trouble transposing an idyllic view of rural development, couched in the narrative act of remembering a North Carolinian rurality of his youth, to an agrarian context that was decades and continents apart. Yet, what is interesting is that Raper's own sociology had mobilized a different kind of comparative approach. Its aim was to illuminate alternatives not by avoiding entrenched inequalities, but exploring their latent possibilities within political societies themselves and the conditions for external, read state interventions. For instance, Raper had formulated a powerful critique of the old Jim Crow order in rural Georgia during the 1920s. First, he showed how economic stagnation and racialized discontent remained pervasive in places where the old order, based on a post-plantation sharecropping economy, had held on. Then, he showed how possibilities for social mobility might arise through non-farm employment and a state-supported agrarian yeomanry in places where the old order had collapsed. His critical study had illuminated the conditions for this collapse and the entrenched socioeconomic inequalities that went with it. This critique informed the basis for his civil rights activism and shaped his secular faith in comparative and historical social science. Mid-20th century decolonization across Asian and African contexts reflected similar possibilities in the wake of a collapsing old order and the appearance of new opportunities for rebuilding state institutions and market relations in favor of the poor and the dispossessed. At the same time, entrenched inequalities took on a specific quality in this global interregnum, where the ramparts of a colonized civil society, as Antonio Gramsci might have put it, continued to secure the post-colonial state against an overt siege from below. In the words of the sociologist and longtime deputy vice president of the Ford Foundation's International Affairs Office, Francis Sutton, quote, "A kind of caste system prevailed in which social behavior and authority were predicated on skin color and racial origin in both governmental and non-governmental affairs. The famous sparseness of the colonial ruling elite was based on more than the control of firearms, indirect rule, and the calculated accommodation of subjects to power. The structure of colonial societies meant that the apparatus of government was both the most conspicuous and prestigious expression of their hierarchical social structures. In a time of rising egalitarian values, their Achilles' heels." Arthur Raper was aware of this dynamic in East Pakistan. Quote, "In some ways, the most wonderful and the most terrible thing about the Kumilla situation is the weight of the individual, not just Akhtar Hamid Khan, but also the president, the minister, and so on," Raper had remarked. Contrary to the deliberative process he had espoused in practice, this was an implicit acknowledgement of colonial hierarchies, where powerful representatives and offices continued to play an oversized role in the top-down steering of community-oriented projects. It reproduced the dominant modernization paradigm where the people in ex-colonies were seen as unprepared to take the reins, since they were somehow, quote, "happily at the beginning of the development process." So here we have an instance of the decolonization process where recycling the ideas and practices of colonial era rural reconstruction were central to the transnational dynamics of post-colonial state-making. How did the proponents and detractors of community development projects negotiate competing expectations and interests? Why did agrarian democratic efforts at rural community development give way to narrow technocratic approaches centered on increasing food yields and population control? Recent scholarship on early community development in East Pakistan and elsewhere impute the origins of neoliberal developmentalism to such projects, disciplining the land poor and landless peasantries through entrenching market relations. These projects are seen as laying the groundwork for what would eventually come to be characterized as the so-called Green Revolution and the subsequent predominance of neoliberal agricultural policies and practices. Drawing on the project's archives, I showed that a critique of early community development hides a more complex picture shaped by a conjunctural confluence of localized, regional, and geopolitical factors. These reveal the transformative conditions contained in the very processes that sought to reproduce capitalist market relations, state practices, and the structural inequalities of class and region. So, what was community development about? Let us consider the geopolitical register first. In the wake of the 2003 US invasion of Iraq, the political scientist Francis Fukuyama invited Ford Foundation's ex-deputy VP Francis Sutton to a conference, where Sutton shared his experiences with nation-building projects during the 1950s and 60s. Quote, "The sources of technical knowledge and other resources mobilized by US agencies and foundations at that time," Sutton claimed, had sought to genuinely serve the interest of their host nations. Among US officials, experts, and volunteers, many were, quote, "disloyal to their own organizations and their countries of origin to the extent that they were loyal to the ideology of development." Sutton was, of course, overplaying his case. However, his observations point to a kernel of truth when we consider the changing geopolitical context in which US hegemony sought to reassert itself. This was a time of increasing egalitarian values, as Sutton had put it, shaped by communist and revolutionary and anti-colonial ideals. Many third world intellectuals and activists, including in Eastern Bengal, were drawn to communist as well as the non-aligned movements on both realpolitik and ideological grounds. The predominance of agricultural livelihoods and entrenched rural inequalities in Eastern Bengal, for instance, had propelled peasant demands for reforming land tenure and revenue arrangements on a more egalitarian basis. Aspiring post-colonial publics had to meet such demands on a terrain where radical proposals provided the more appealing alternative. US officials, experts, and policymakers resorted to searching for responses from within, so to speak. They settled on the New Deal's legacies of agrarian modernization and its once promising hopes of establishing agrarian democracy in conjunction with federally planned interventions from above. Community development was their answer to the radical upending of property, revenue, and market relations in the countryside. The Ford Foundation was a catalytic institution here. Its stature as a seemingly autonomous private philanthropy made it an ideal vehicle for constituting a US-centric transnational public amid the growing traction of non-alignment and anti-imperialist sentiments. Moreover, the Ford Foundation had more financial resources under its command than all the UN agencies combined, at least until the early 1960s. With its backing, ex-New Dealers and proponents of agrarian democracy, like Arthur Raper, found a new calling. Futures past at home motivated their newfound role as apostles for a new world order. An early community development project in Pakistan was christened Village Agriculture and Industrial Development Program, or VAID in bureaucraties. The initial idea was to hire and train low-ranking state employees as community or village-level social workers and agricultural extension officers. Trained in social scientific methods and organizational skills, Their task was to discover the felt needs of rural communities from which they were recruited. In practice, these positions sought to create a source of employment for the educated rural middle classes in public administration, channeling the energies of restive elements into nation-building tasks and away from the so-called quote subversive political commitments. These tasks were not just about discovering, but also educating quote the felt needs of the villager in terms of discussing the constraints and possibilities of accessing rural credit and produce markets and the importing of seeds, machinery, and new farming techniques. These were considered necessary for the viability of present agriculture modeled on the family farm. For early community developers and post-colonial publics, raising labor productivity in agriculture was not an end in itself, but the means for facilitating urban-centric industrial growth. Agrarian modernization in the service of industrial growth was seen as complementary according to the precepts of modernization theory. The fact that development planning for industrialization ran roughshod over the felt needs of peasant cultivators in many places, including in the villages of rural eastern Bengal, was soon evident to some of these publics. Early dissent from above were expressed in terms of the unsuitability of U.S. technical assistance. A veteran agronomist associated with Truman's Point 4 program, Horace Holmes, spoke of, quote, the innate intelligence of the peasant in deploying local implements and seed varieties, adapted through generations of actual practice and experimentation through trial and error, which worked better with both the ecological conditions and habits of the farmers. This followed his trip to villages across the region. Similarly, the agricultural economist Randall Clem, who was then acting as the Ford Foundation's representative to Pakistan, admitted that the use of American farming technologies was wholly inappropriate. Rather, he was enthusiastic about advancing indigenous technologies and crop experimentation at one of the centers in Sylhet, urging his senior colleagues to consider the scaling up of these efforts. However, as an official at the USTCA's Pakistan office reminded his colleagues, it was not the nature of technical and financial assistance, but, quote, the social mode of their delivery that mattered. The geostrategic imperative was clear. Amid the Manichaean framing of the Cold War, it seemed only natural that community development efforts should aim to secure the support of those with political authority and economic power in the countryside. Community development was thus seen as antithetical to the reconfiguration of rural property, and thereby political power in the name of preventing, quote, anarchy and subversion. However, its immediate or practical rationale was shaped by more specific geopolitical and regional concerns. The threat of a communist takeover in Pakistan was already remote by the early 1950s. By 1954, the Pakistani center, dominated by civil and military bureaucrats in Karachi and Rawalpindi, had cemented several mutual security pacts with the United States. A compelling but vague geostrategic imaginary where the two wings of Pakistan were seen as ideal for US bases, securing resource-rich areas in Southeast and West Asia, formed the basis for these military pacts. Consequently, a stable post-colonial regime in Pakistan became a foreign policy prerogative for the United States at a moment when the non-aligned movement was gaining traction. As the Eisenhower administration emphasized, Pakistan's security meant more than military support and diplomatic cover for the regime. It required creating the conditions for economic development via trade and aid. By this time, the Pakistani center was firmly in the hands of an ex-colonial civil military bureaucracy that was unwilling to concede to political demands for constitutional federalism. The 1947 partition had resulted in the concentration of the colonial state's administrative and military capacities in Western Pakistan. This was exacerbated by the skewed interregional distribution of agrarian, financial, and industrial capitals. However, the slim demographic advantage of its eastern province in Bengal combined with the organization of major political parties along regional lines, gave emerging left-of-center parties like the Awami League a powerful voting bloc. These inherited disparities, together with the East's continued dependence on primary commodity production and agricultural exports, soon shaped the main line of political contention between the two wings of the state. Racialized attitudes of a Western-centric Islamic Pakistanism elided ethno-linguistic and cultural differences. So for proponents of community development among US and Pakistani officials, such projects were seen as a potential instrument for assuaging internal dissent while showcasing the potential dividends of US alignment to others. As a result, V8 was proclaimed to be a great success despite its limited reach and effect. The assertions were not substantiated. Instead, a positive spin laid the groundwork for a US-backed military coup that brought General Ayub Khan to power in 1958. The regime sought legitimacy by emphasizing the principle of development first, democracy later, which by now found support in influential arguments made by modernization theorists, claiming that widening economic inequality was a precondition for both industrial takeoff and its eventual leveling. Ayub Khan's coup had come in the wake of both external repression and internal failures of the United Front government in East Pakistan. Party politics in the western provinces too were curtailed by an emboldened civilian military bureaucracy backed by emerging oligarchic interests. A decade later, the regime was ousted in a mass uprising across Pakistan to the dismay of many US officials and foundation administrators. Following the disintegration of Pakistan and the onset of a brutal civil war in 1971, many among this milieu were disillusioned by the turn of events in what was touted by them as Pakistan's decade of development. So what had happened during this decade? In rural East Pakistan, issues of landlessness and land fragmentation, unemployment, and indebtedness had intensified. The separation of political democratization from economic development, or the prioritizing of growth over distribution in the making of a national economy, was itself politicized by an emerging cross-class coalition in East Pakistan. The autocratic turn at the center was characterized by attempts to secure the loyalty of social segments within rural Bengal, including landed peasantries, the educated and urbanizing middle classes, petty trading and money lending interests, local council leaders, and petty officials. Such segments had filled the political power vacuum following the end of colonial-era landlordism and extractive arrangements, and the gradual but large-scale departure of both Hindu property owners as well as lower-caste peasant and artisan communities. The political practical workings of Kumila cooperatives illustrate some of these dynamics. So the former director of V8, Akhtar Hamid Khan, was based in Kumilla since the early 1950s. He was instrumental in establishing the Pakistan Academy for Rural Development in Kumilla. Operational funding had come from the Ford Foundation, and the academy was staffed by both domestic and foreign officials, experts, and advisors. By 1958, the academy's outreach activities had led to the direct participation of local farmers, artisans, educated youth, and village-level officials in several of its programs. The most important among them was the local credit association. The association was Khan's brainchild. This is how he reflected on its objective years later in Addis Ababa, where he was invited by a government in the process of carrying out radical land reforms. Quote, smallholders and occupancy tenants were the real agriculturalists, from whom came the marketable surplus. The credit association encouraged their participation and attempted to keep large landowners out, since the latter appeared more interested in becoming creditors and traders rather than self-sufficient farmers. Support for the credit association expanded through informal networks, word-of-mouth messaging, and outreach by the academy staff. Leaders of several village-level associations met at the academy's campus regularly. They conducted business on behalf of members, from depositing proceeds to taking out new loans, pooling resources for investment on equipment and infrastructure, including the building and maintenance of a warehouse for storing surplus produce. The warehouse was important to members during the main summer and monsoon harvest seasons when market prices were low. Its storage facilities enabled them to secure better prices for the surplus produce during the dry season. The meetings of the Credit Association were also opportunities for members to participate in the Academy's activities, from adult literacy programs to learning about new farming techniques and technologies. Soon, the Academy became a forum for voicing concerns, disseminating ideas, and sharing results through what was clearly an early prefiguration of participatory action research. Arthur Raper observed these processes closely during his time in Kumilla. He saw a hope for prosperity neither in the individualist gospel based on the family farm, nor in the technical sense of reducing poverty rates. Rather, he noticed how Khan, the Academy staff, and local participants were charting an alternate path, one that was aimed at reconfiguring rural power relations in favor of smallholders and tenant cultivators. The credit cooperative was a promising instrument. By removing the middlemen from credit and warehousing provisions, the association had created an alternate locus of socioeconomic power among peasant cultivators and enabled their capacity for collective decision-making on productive investment. Between 1963 and 64, members had increased by 13% for the village-level credit societies, and deposits rose by 60%, Raper had reported enthusiastically. The Credit Association also became crucial for channeling investment in tube well pumps for irrigation in the drier months. However, tensions were rife from the very beginning. In 1962, Raper's first year in Kumilla, Pakistan's military regime and the newly consolidated US aid had jointly facilitated the rollout of a multi-year rural works program in Kumilla Thana, with the stated aim of improving infrastructure and creating employment during the winter season. Assistance came in the form of imported PL 480 wheat, and the workers were paid partly in kind. While this was designed as an anti-inflationary measure, it did not work as intended and eventually faced heavy criticism from various quarters on both political, economic, and cultural grounds. The regime increasingly publicized the activities of the Academy as part of a wider show of interest in, quote, rural development, when in fact, its policies neglected agrarian questions in favor of urban-centric industrialization, mainly in the western wing of the country. Meanwhile, absentee landlords and other rural notables were wary of the Academy's activities from the start. Its external resources and efforts to organize cooperatives among poorer peasants threatened their political and economic influence. After Ayub Khan's coup, the regime implemented its infamous basic democracy scheme, basically an autocratic measure for civilianizing the regime that relied on the so-called electoral support of rural notables and petty officials in exchange for public works contracts, import licenses, and tariff breaks, while drastically curtailing the franchise. Networks forged by V8 training centers were deployed as pipelines for channeling aid funds to powerful segments among large landowners, traders, and segments of the rural middle classes. The so-called basic Democrats would vote in the president directly under a new 1962 constitution that was unilaterally adopted by the regime. Akhtar Hamid Khan's directorship of the Academy posed a problem for the regime. First, the alternative locus of power that motivated the credit cooperatives in Kumilla did not conform to the kind of patron-client relations that the basic democracy scheme wanted to secure in the countryside. Second, Akhtar Hamid's communitarian ideas and his popularity within the powerful MSU Fort Foundation nexus made him a less than pliable ally for the regime. This was probably why it had attempted to lure Khan away from the Academy's directorship in 1962 by offering him the chancellorship of Dhaka University, which he promptly declined. Subsequently, the tactic of appropriating the Academy's symbolic capital shifted. Ayub Khan's handpicked governor in East Pakistan, Ghulam Farooq Khan, called for the rapid expansion of the Academy's activities and support for rural works. Akhtar Hamid and his staff knew that the complexities involved would end up delegitimizing the Academy's primary objective of tackling rural inequalities through the credit associations. At the same time, prospects of official support in the short run were attractive. Expanding the membership in Kumilla Thana or county had already attracted members who were not peasant cultivators. For instance, moneyed and landed segments commanding sharecropping rents, urban incomes, and sizable surpluses increasingly supported the Academy's tubal irrigation initiative, since these promised private gains through new rounds of lending and import trading. For them, the financial viability of the cooperative was secondary to the opportunities it afforded for importing, leasing, and maintaining pump equipment. Raper had picked up on the social class dynamics involved. He framed, quote, the real issue before the Kumilla Academy as the continued operational integrity and unity among staff. This managerial language of documentation inflected deeper anxieties regarding the supposed compatibility between the means for instituting an agrarian democratic ethos and the normative ends pursued within the Cold War framing of agrarian modernization. Quote, the modernization of the Bengali village, which is an end in and of itself, can likely be achieved peacefully to the extent that the natural revolutionary elements of the village are actively involved in the developmental processes. Raper had remarked earlier. Within a year of his stay, he was less certain. He knew that transferring the Credit Association's leadership from the Academy to its membership was necessary, but inadequate in terms of countering the influence of those seeking to privatize the cooperative's gains. Matters here were not helped when U.S. aid advisor and agronomist Ben Ferguson initiated a relatively large-scale project of training extension workers in the villages of central Mymensingh, about 100 miles northwest of Kumilla. U.S. aid backing of Ferguson over the Kumilla cooperatives marked political and ideological differences. Ferguson relied on training extension field workers with the objective of securing the acceptability of capital-intensive farming methods among the better-off landed peasantries, without regard for long-term distributive consequences. Meanwhile, mitigating rural inequalities were central to the proponents of the Kumilla cooperative, even as the successes of this project had opened possibilities for undermining its egalitarian ends. So political societal dynamics, mediated by an autocratic regime bent on securing a rural power base, propelled contentions over the practical means of agrarian modernization. Growth in terms of yields per acre soon triumphed over distributive concerns in rural developmental thinking. With support from the Agricultural Development Council, a philanthropic arm of the Rockefellers' fortune, an international network of research stations developed and promoted hybrid seeds dependent on capital-intensive methods, from pump irrigation to inorganic fertilizers, for increasing yields. The post-colonial states agency were increasingly embedded within these transnational networks, facilitating the adoption of such methods and technologies which were repackaged by the late 1960s as the Green Revolution. Its trickle-down rationale, however, did little to stem resentment arising from persistent rural inequalities. Meanwhile, expectations of agrarian democracy in community development thinking and practice gave way to a narrow technocratic framing in terms of the twin nodes of more food production and population control. Of course, the latter is, there's a complicated history to that, but basically measures for sterilizing the process that came to be euphemized as family planning. It was under these conditions that a movement for regional autonomy found support in rural Pakistan. So with that, I will pause. Let me say thank you. And we do have a little bit of time, so I would love to hear from you any questions. And yeah. So I think there are people in the room, but I'm not sure if I can hear them or if I don't know how the questions or conversation might happen now. I just want to say I'm sorry that I couldn't make it in person. It's that time of the semester where, it's hard for me to extricate myself and travel, but hopefully next year I'll see some of you. Yeah.
Well,
Thanks so
Mushahid,
much. Is there, oh, good, questions?
yeah. Rachel, did you want to go first?
No, I just wanted to invite questions and to thank Mushahid for a great presentation. It was really interesting. So please, over to others.
Well, Mushahid, I had just a quick question because you've expanded this a little bit more than what was there in the dissertation.
Right.
Here's this. I wonder to what extent the density of the details of the local, the particular, the contingent, in the face of all that density of fascinating details, the larger constraining forces or shaping forces of the post-war global decolonization movement, the Global Development Initiative, the global Cold War, geopolitical contestations increasingly recede. So how do you navigate the need to sort of talk about what's happening in a particular place in as much detail as you can, while retaining a sense of the larger forces shaping them, right? So in the first part of your presentation, you gave us that. In the second part, you gave us a much more detailed thing, but how the two connected was not readily apparent from this presentation. How do you think about those kinds of things? How do you mediate the relationship between the particular and the larger forces that you find compelling?
Okay. Thank you for that. Should I? Yeah, I'll take maybe a couple of questions and answer them. Yes. I think Frederick has. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi.
Okay. I am from Guyana,
Hi.
and my interest is I recall the traumatic separation and the days of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. And so coming to I was interested to know what I was going to hear this afternoon from a general standpoint. Now, the direct question. I got a little bit of courage from what the previous speaker said, because it seemed to me there were so many spinning wheels that you were dealing with. I kind of wondered if how much confidence one could have that whatever conclusion you were going to draw from the different circumstances, the Americans operating. Sometimes, as we know, they don't operate in good faith. How much confidence you can have in your conclusion. And finally, I did find maybe I wasn't listening enough, but I couldn't tell when you said in Pakistan, except when you said in East Pakistan, whether you were referring to the Pakistan as that geographical locus, or whether you were speaking about what became East Pakistan. So perhaps you might need to tidy up there. Thanks.
Thank you. I don't know if I see any other hands, so maybe I can So yeah, I'll just start with Frederick. Yeah, just to clarify, East Pakistan became Bangladesh in 1971. So that's sort of the geographic locale that's sort of where this all this is based, right? I think there's a thread to what Fuad you've asked and the second question in terms of, yeah, how do I extricate myself from this and look at the bigger picture in terms of, the broader sort of post-colonial transition. And I think in the presentation itself today, my sort of aim was to kind of introduce us a little bit to how I got to the project and talk a little bit about its sort of broader framing. And then think about a paper that I'm currently working on, drawing on this chapter and expanding on it, and see what comes out of it. And I don't think I have sort of clarified the link between the two sections too clearly, but in my mind, it seems to me that there is always a kind of, at least in this segment, when we talk about post-colonial state making and its transnational connections, we often tend to flatten sometimes the sort of contending aspects of the actors involved in this process for whatever reasons, right? And again, I wanted to kind of get into the historical details to bring some of that out, right? Something that I sort of begin with by talking a little bit about how sort of a national biography. So whenever we talk about those 24 odd years in Bangladesh, for example, or scholarship on Bangladesh studies in general, right? That period, again, is somehow sort of out of the picture. And I think it's very productive for us to look at that moment to understand sort of both the broader sort of global decolonization as sort of this uneven and combined process that's taking place in different sort of, I don't know, wavelengths, temporalities. That's the kind of language that I use for this. But yes, it doesn't really come out in the presentation itself, but hopefully as I present the paper, it will come through. So apart from that, if there's anything specific that you thought of when you were asking that question, maybe I can get to that as well. Other than that, I can also take other questions. I mean, we can talk about this. Yeah.
Yeah, let's give other people a chance to ask.
Yeah.
Hi, Mushahid, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you, but let me raise my volume a little. Okay. Yes.
Where is the mic that we're speaking in?
Is
this better?
Oh yes, now it's better.
Oh, it is this.
For sure. Yeah.
I think it's on. Do you want to go first? Go for it. Go for it. Mushahid, no, that was fascinating. Thank you so much. I guess I had a couple of pieces I wanted to ask you about. One is just in terms of, I think Bangladesh is such an interesting case in that you get the decolonization moment and the national economy constitution in the 70s. And in a sense, the sort of global political economic conjuncture is so different than the 45 moment. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about what's the difference that makes the difference, as Phil would say? Like what's the difference of a moment of decolonization and national formation happening in the moment of sort of flexible specialization, or that kind of turn towards flexibilized economies, the kind of stagflations that's taking place in the global north? How does that kind of structure the process of post-colonial state formation in a way that's different from West Pakistan and the way in which some of those dynamics unfold in that region? And then similarly, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the connection, because there seems real connections here in some of the arguments that you're making in the work of somebody like Radhika Desai, who's arguing similarly the sort of second democratic counter-revolution, she calls it, in terms of middle-landed castes in the 40s and 50s, pushing back against any kind of land reform that could possibly emerge in the post-colonial movement. So I'm wondering if there's a similar tie, or if you see certain forms of broader social movements that can be considered ways in which the dominant peasant castes and classes are pushing back against the possibility of landed reform, so that you end in a moment of community development rather than a moment of radical redistribution. You touched on this a little, but I wanted to sort of give you the chance to talk about that a little bit more, perhaps.
Thanks. I think I recognize the voice. Aman. Okay.
You do.
And Okay, two questions there, and if there's anything else, I might take another one and then talk about what Aman just asked. Okay, thanks Aman for that. I think let's the second question first. Like, look, my project really sort of starts looking at what's happening in East Pakistan after 1947, especially around 1950, when you have a kind of a strange thing happening where the partition remains quiet, the kind of partition violence that you see in 47 in the West doesn't really take place, but in 50 it erupts. And there's that whole discussion on the partition and its sort of long partition, its violence and what it does to communities and all that, that emerges out of that moment, of course, and a lot has been written. So I kind of begin that project by looking at not so much sort of the communal violence and the rioting and all that, but how it ties to sort of tussles between folks in rural areas around questions of property, around questions of dispossession. And that's how I sort of begin. And I think it's in that moment, and unfortunately, I couldn't talk a little bit about that earlier moment here. It's in that moment that sort of community development ideas sort of start to make a comeback, right? There's when things, aspirations are high and they're not met, a situation arises where people are increasingly resentful or discontent. And there's also a certain kind of nostalgia that enters through the back door where you kind of go back to thinking about rural reconstruction projects. Some of the same officials are becoming a part of these projects. When that happens, you have a situation where, the kind of Tebaga and all the sort of radical sort of efforts, or even a lot of the indigenous peasant struggles in different parts of Eastern Bengal are brutally repressed by 1948. And by 1950, you have sort of this communalization of a certain kind that, it looks very different in the rural areas than it does in some of the towns. So anyway, I think some of that context is really important, in short, to understand that the question that you just posed, like, why did it not take the kind of turn that it could have when you're talking about community development as a kind of, a way of, there's of course the geopolitical stuff that I bring up, but not so much from what's happening from the ground up, right? And I think that aspect is very important for us to understand why it didn't happen. How were sort of some of these sort of, let's say, constituencies, right, divided up along communal and sort of property lines during that moment is what I explore actually in my first chapter for the dissertation. But anyway, that's a really interesting question for me as well. The second question, and I'll stop with that, like, briefly. What happens after 71, of course? I think you can see some of the traces. Like, one of the things that happen is that there is a total disillusionment with kind of supporting states by folks in the Ford Foundation and so on, who kind of held up the Pakistan case as, a kind of model that might work, So when that happens, there's a move towards, again, like, looking for other actors, let's say non-governmental organizations, right? That kind of start to take on the mantle that these earlier programs of community development that was really about sort of building state capacity. It relied on a certain kind of New Deal legacy of, like, the Farm Security Administration. That kind of thinking starts to disappear by the mid 70s, and a whole range of other institutional sort of setups, along with, of course, new state agencies kind of start to operate in really advancing what now becomes sort of the only game in town, which is a kind of green revolution style agrarian change that a lot of people have talked about. So I don't really look at that in this project, of course, but it's, again, super interesting. And I'm actually working with somebody right now who does some of this stuff in Indonesia. And we're trying to do a kind of comparative thing in the 70s to see where this is going. But anyway, I'll stop there. Thanks. I don't know if anybody else had something in the room, or let's see. Okay.
Maybe if there's nobody raising a question, I'll go back to my question and say, I was one way, Mushahid, I can imagine how you can bring in the larger context with particular histories that you tell within Bangladesh is maybe looking at the particular institutions at different scales, let's say from the American state to the Ford Foundation, to the Bangladeshi state or the Pakistani state, to the local community development agencies, to the particular expertise involved in these things. In other words, each of these sites are part of the chain of links that allow you to trace the relationship of the wider set of forces with the particular relations and dynamics in the local area. So it doesn't feel so abstract, right? It feels like they crystallize in particular institutions, particular kinds of relations across different scales, right? From the wider international dynamics to regional forces to the local community and so on. And I think you have that, but it might be necessary to sort of emphasize how these links work and operate with all their tensions and contradictions, of course.
Yeah.
That's what I meant by my question. How do you mediate it? That's what I was referring to.
Okay. That makes total sense to me. I mean, one of the reasons why I actually focused on the Kumilla Academy is precisely because it kind of mobilized this locus of different institutions, like from the Ford Foundation to what was happening at the State Department and it kind of allowed me to kind of see, okay, who are the people involved? What kinds of interests and expectations they're bringing in this kind of broader moment where really this sort of what one of them calls rising egalitarian values actually inform a lot of the decisions that they make. But by the end of the 60s, you have, I mean, the bifurcation has become very clear. On the one hand, some who are very strongly in favor of a certain kind of ground up, sort of facilitating a certain kind of approach to rural development that looks very different from betting on the rich, right? In these particular contexts, to take up capital intensive farming, to double down on certain kinds of green revolution things that become sort of prevalent later. But yeah, that's sort of something that I wanted to show by way of saying that moment allows us in a way, like every moment, to kind of bring out fragments of that totality that oppose what we come to think of as the overdriving logic of, okay, this is how it had to happen because that's what happened, So, yeah. I think, yeah, there's, let me see. I just have to check if any hand is up now. I don't see anything. So it's probably a long day at the end of a long week for everyone. So unless there are questions, yeah.
We're lucky to have Shelley Feldman in the room here.
Oh yes, hi,
Obviously
Shelley.
an expert on these things. And I wonder if, not to put you on the spot, Shelley, if you wanted to share some reflections.
Oh, yes, I do see her. Okay.
Not really, but I'm.
Oh.
Maybe that's better.
Oh, yes. Hi, Shelley.
No, it was a delightful presentation, and it brought back very personal memories for me because I knew Akhtar Hamid and a lot of these old guys. But I think you've really played a very interesting space of emphasizing the different possibilities and potentials of what development could have meant and a nice critique of the kinds of people that you dealt with, like Raper and so on, and the translation of one sort of strategy in two different sites. And you just I really appreciated your opening up that space to really think differently about some of the issues that framed everyday life, but also the everyday strategies that really were embedded in rural life. I mean, I spent my first time in Bangladesh, the first 6 months at Comilla. So
Right.
I have a particular fondness for it, and the struggles. And by the time I was there, the struggles were very different, of course. And the imagined future of something much better was already bypassed, unfortunately. But it was nice. You did a really beautiful job. So thank you for sharing it, and thanks for letting me in.
Thank you, Shelley. It's good to hear from you.
Hi, Mushahid. This is Yumna.
Hi,
Congratulations and fascinating work. I see it turning into a book and being taught in Fuad's modernity course. So it's really, really nice. So I will ask a question that's not really like well formulated, but I saw that you relied on like sources that I'm interested in, like some of these very beautiful slides of books that you have. So I am also grappling with temporality and time theories, and I wanted and I'm reading a lot in that, and I'm trying to find angles that is like can be like historical sociology, but also like these temporality and time theories. And did you end up relying on like theoretical categories of memory, nostalgia, and that, or you dig in like different theoretical categories? And like, look, can you elaborate more on like how did you theoretically like entangle the time and temporality theories, if possible? And thank you so much, Mushahid. Congratulations again.
Thank you, Yomna, for sticking to the end of it and for the question. So yeah, I think it's a really good question. But one of the things that really helped me think about all this as I was working through is I have that quote from Dale Talmage where sort of what is the role of theory, and by this I mean a substantive theory. Like, how do we bring in categories that allow us to specify, right? What is it that we are looking at, and get a different sort of lens on the situation, let's say. And the other, I think, aspect of it is what kinds of categories do people use in these contexts, right? Like, so one of the terms that Pakistan Amal. So when we talk about decolonization, it has a very specific term in Bangladesh, in contemporary Bangladesh right now. So whenever I started thinking about that category, it's a kind of colloquial term, right? And I was trying to find, okay, like I'm also, so okay, this is the substantive theory, and I'm convinced that this can help me explain some of the processes that I'm interested in. At the same time, how do I bring in sort of how sort of everyday terms and practices are also sort of, part of what this category might actually specify, right? What this theoretical category of, the middle class, for example, like one of the processes that I look at is the formation of a certain kind of middle class, not so much out of, in the cultural sphere, and but more so in this agrarian context where it's really about a tussle for property in a situation where you have communal conflict on the rise. So in that situation, I'm just sort of grappling with, what do I do when I confront the archives and then not get lost in the details as Fuad was mentioning, right? And come out of it in terms of giving us a better sense of the processes. So again, like my thing was in short, pretty simple, that we need to study these 4 processes that work together. I think all of us are kind of interested in these overlapping processes. When we talk about temporalities, my sort of like in sort of non-jargony terms, it would simply be that each of these processes have its own sort of historical timeline that I'm trying to trace through the actors involved, and sort of specifying it through this kind of conjunctural inflection and saying, hey, this is what is happening at this moment. Why does it matter for us now? Of course, we can get to some of those questions in terms of, yeah, people are still thinking with these categories, and it's a certain way of thinking about things rather than, trying to sort of live the past, and there's already a lot of that going on, making this and that great and so on. So anyway, I don't know. Yeah, that was a rambling answer, but I think Yomna we'll have to talk about that at some point again. So let me see if I have any questions in the chat before I. Okay, jump off. Congrats. Thanks. Okay, good. So I think we have about 5 minutes. So if anybody wants to raise anything.
Well,
Okay.
hopefully you'll come back, Mushahid, and
Yeah, I need to.
won't be a stranger,
Yes.
and join us in other conversations we'll have.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate this.
Thanks. So thank you again. And I think that, I don't know, how do we close this? Because it's, I don't know, Zoom, I don't know the etiquette for like, is that it?
Virar is still here. He probably will
Oh,
close it.
okay. All right.
Bravo.
All right, Mushahid, take care.